The train was 12 minutes late. Callum Reach knew this because he had counted. Not from impatience, he had learned long ago that impatience was a luxury like a warm fire or a second opinion. He counted because counting was something to do with his hands when they weren't busy, and idle hands on Callum Reach had a way of drifting toward old habits. He stood at the far end of the platform, back against the depot wall out of the direct sun. The position was not accidental. From there he could see the length of the platform, the road that came in from the east, the livery across the street, where a boy was pretending to sweep, but mostly watching the tracks. Callum watched the boy. The boy did not watch him back. That was fine. Billings in July of 1931 smelled like hot iron and dry manure, and the particular kind of dust that settled into your collar and stayed there until wash day. The Depression had pressed down on the town like a thumb on a bruise, not breaking anything outright, just making everything slightly more tender than it used to be. Storefronts that had been two businesses were now one. Men who had been employed were now purposeful looking, which was different. There were more horses than automobiles again, which told you something. Callum noted all of this the way he noted most things, without affect, without particular opinion. He was 41 years old in the way that certain men were 41. The number was accurate but incomplete. The face was older in the eyes and younger around the jaw, and the hands belonged to a different decade entirely. He had not shaved since Tuesday. This was not an oversight. He was holding a piece of paper folded in thirds. On the outside, in his own handwriting, he had written a name, D. Vane. The letters were large and slightly uneven. The kind of writing a man produces when he knows his penmanship is poor and tries too hard to compensate. He had almost brought flowers. He had stood in front of Hetman's shop for 4 full minutes that morning considering it, and then decided against. Not because he was indifferent, but because flowers seemed like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep yet. The sign, at least, was honest. It said, "Here is someone who knows your name." It said nothing else. The train announced itself before it appeared a low pressure shift in the air. Then the sound, then the smoke rising above the tree line to the south. Callum straightened slightly. Around him, the platform filled with the particular energy of people who had been waiting and were now almost done waiting, which is its own kind of tension. He watched them come down. He always watched. It was not something he decided to do. It was something that happened the way breathing happened, the way his right hand dropped slightly when he stood still for too long. 6 years of a particular kind of work had built it into his body, and he had never fully built it back out. You learn to read arrivals who scan the crowd, and who looked straight ahead, who carried their luggage like it weighed what it weighed, and who carried it like it weighed something else entirely. He saw her before she saw him. She came down the steps third from last, and she was doing something that most people on that platform were not doing. She was looking, not at faces or not only at faces. She was cataloging. The exit points the road width the distance between the depot and the nearest building with an alley behind it. Her eyes moved the way a careful person's eyes move when they have trained themselves not to look careful. Callum recognized it because he had spent years being paid to notice exactly that. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair pinned back too precisely for the heat, and a traveling dress the color of old wood that had been pressed but not recently. She carried one bag which was not large, which told him something. Her shoes were good, which told him something else. She was not poor. She was not traveling light because she couldn't afford more. She was traveling light because she had thought carefully about what she might need to leave behind quickly. She reached the bottom step and stopped, scanned the platform, found the sign with her name on it. Her face did not change. That was the tell. Most people, when they see someone holding their name in a strange city, have a small involuntary reaction, relief or anxiety or something between. She had neither. She looked at the sign the way you look at a street marker, when you already know where you are confirming information already held. She walked toward him. "Mr. Reach," she said, not a question. "Miss Vane." He lowered the sign. There was a pause of approximately 3 seconds in which both of them did the thing that people do when they meet someone they have corresponded with but never seen, the rapid, wordless accounting between the person imagined and the person actual. "The wagon's across the street," Callum said. "All right," she said. That was the entirety of it. He took her bag without asking, and she led him without comment, which was either a sign of trust or exhaustion, and he didn't yet know her well enough to tell the difference. They rode out of Billings in the mid-afternoon heat with very little said between them. This was not uncomfortable. Callum had spent enough time with enough people to know that silence had textures. The tight silence of anger, the soft silence of grief, the wary silence of two strangers trying to determine how much of themselves was safe to put down. This was the last kind. It had a quality of alertness to it, a mutual unspoken agreement to observe before concluding. The road west ran through low hills covered in dry yellow grass that moved in long, slow waves when the wind came through. The sky was enormous. Montana's sky in July was not subtle. It pressed down on everything below it with a frank physical weight, making the land feel small and the people on it feel smaller. And the things they were worried about feel either more serious or less serious, depending on the kind of person you were. Callum drove with one hand on the reins. The other rested on his thigh. He was aware of her looking at the land. "Different from Philadelphia," he said. It was not a question, just an observation offered into the space between them, like something left on a table for the other person to pick up or leave. She looked at him, then back at the horizon. "Yes," she said. He nodded. That was enough. After a mile or so, she said, "How long have you had the property?" "About 7 years. And before that," he was quiet for a beat. "Different work," he said. She didn't ask what kind. He noticed that. Most people asked what kind. The tack jingled softly. A hawk turned overhead in a slow circle, not hunting, just riding the air, letting the thermals carry it. Callum watched it for a moment. "There's a room at the back of the house," he said. "It has its own door to the outside. I thought you'd want to know that." She turned to look at him again, and this time she held it a moment longer. "Thank you," she said. And then, after a pause, "That's a careful thing to offer." "It's a practical thing," he said. She looked back at the road ahead. Something in her shoulders had changed. Not relaxed exactly, but redistributed. Like a person shifting weight to a steadier foot. They drove on. The ranch was small and organized in the way that things get organized when a single person has lived with them long enough to develop strong opinions about where things should go. The barn needed paint on the south side. The fencing along the west pasture was new, fresh wood straight posts. The house itself was 2 rooms and a kitchen, solidly built, nothing decorative, like a sentence with all the adjectives removed. She stood in the doorway of the main room and took it in. There was a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of tools, a single window facing south. On the windowsill, a coffee tin repurposed as a planter growing something small and struggling. There were no photographs. There was one painting, a landscape dark and badly executed, hung slightly crooked on the north wall, in the way that things get hung when no one else has ever told you it's crooked. "There's food," Callum said from behind her. "I can cook, though. I'll tell you now, I don't do it well." "I cook," she said. "Then we've settled something." She walked to the window, looked out at the pasture, looked at the coffee tin planter and its struggling occupant. "What is it?" she asked. "Lavender," he said. "Or it was supposed to be. I'm told they need more water than I give them." She looked at it for a long moment. There was something in her face that she didn't appear to notice, something that arrived quietly and stayed briefly, and was gone before she turned around. Whatever it was, he didn't name it. It wasn't his to name yet. "I'll water it," she said. "All right," he said. That evening he made coffee, and she cooked eggs and cornbread, and they ate at the table with the lamp between them. And the conversation moved in short, practical intervals: the well, the nearest town; the mail schedule, the name of the horse. Her name was Ruth the horse, old and opinionated, and inclined to stop walking when she felt she had walked far enough. Dora found this information satisfying in a way she did not explain. Callum found himself watching her hands. They were not soft hands, which surprised him, given Philadelphia. They had worked. The knuckles were slightly enlarged at the first joint, the kind you get from cold water and years of domestic labor. She held her fork the way someone holds something they have used enough times that the grip is automatic. She ate without ceremony. He respected that. After the dishes were cleared, she sat back down with a cup of coffee and said, "I'd like to know what to expect. In general or specifically?" "Both." He thought about that. "Mornings are early. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles. Deputy Sykes comes through the county road twice a week on routine patrol Tuesday and Friday." He paused. "Reverend Hollowell holds service in town Sunday morning. I don't generally attend." "Why not?" "We don't agree on some things. Religious things, practical things," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them pressed it. She finished her coffee. "I'll take the back room," she said. "I know," he said. She stood and then stopped. "Mr. Reach," she said. "Callum." A pause. "Callum, I'd like to understand something from the start." She chose her words with a deliberateness that was neither cold nor warm, just careful. "I came here in good faith. I expect to work hard and contribute fairly. I don't expect anything I haven't agreed to. I hope that's mutual." He looked at her for a moment. "It is," he said. She nodded once in the way that people nod when they've said what needed saying and now they can move forward. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Miss Vane." "Dora." she said already at the hallway. He sat with his coffee for a while after she'd gone. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, something rustled in the grass. A mouse, probably, or the beginning of wind. He drank the rest of what was in his cup and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest he got most nights to peace. 3 days passed in the ordinary way of early arrangements. She learned where the tools were kept. He learned that she preferred silence in the mornings and was more forthcoming after noon. She discovered that the back room had a gap under the door that let in cold air, and that Callum had apparently lived with this for 7 years without addressing it, which she found mildly astonishing. He found her one morning sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a small notebook, writing something that she closed when she heard him come in, not guiltily, just privately. He registered this and said nothing. On the 4th morning, he said, "There's an old mare I've been meaning to work with, if you're interested." She looked up from the stove. "Work with how?" "Ride. She's been kept for pulling and she doesn't think much of herself, but she's sound enough." "I haven't ridden much," she said. "It shows," he said. "Most people who haven't ridden say they haven't ridden like it might not be obvious. You said it like you've already accounted for it." She considered this. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," he said. She came anyway. The mare's name was Pearl, and Callum had been understating things when he called her old. She was gray-muzzled and patient in the way of animals who had moved through enough human distress to have stopped being affected by it. She stood in the paddock while Dora approached with the careful, sidelong walk of someone who respected that horses were larger than they looked in her imagination. Callum showed her the basics without editorializing. How to approach from the side, where to put her hands, the difference between guiding and fighting. "She'll go where you think she's going," he said. "Don't change your mind part way." That sounds like advice for more than horses. "Most of it is," he said. She mounted with more composure than he expected. Pearl took 2 steps to the side, testing, and Dora corrected with her knees, rather than the reins, which was either luck or instinct. They moved in a slow circle around the paddock. The first fall came 10 minutes later. Pearl shied at nothing visible the way old horses sometimes do, when their joints are speaking to them. And Dora went sideways into the dust with a sound that was half surprise and half something she'd been holding in for days. She sat there a moment in the dirt, assessing the inventory of her body. Then she laughed. It came out of her involuntarily short, unguarded, the kind of laugh that belongs to a person alone, rather than to a person being watched. She caught it quickly, but not before it had happened. Callum, who was standing at the fence, kept his face neutral, but something in him noted it and filed it somewhere careful. She got up, dusted off, got back on. The second fall was more dignified in that she had time to see it coming, which gave her the opportunity to be slightly more controlled about landing in the same dust. She sat for a moment, then said, mostly to herself, undignified, "That one was better," Callum said. "That's not a high bar." "No," he agreed. She got up again, got on again. They rode until the sun had moved 2 hours across the sky, and Pearl had decided she'd been cooperative long enough. Callum watched her figure out that the horse's patience had limits and adjust accordingly, which was more than most people managed on a first afternoon. Walking back to the house, Pearl trailing between them, Dora said, "Your neighbor 3 miles out. You said that like it was significant. The Pruitts, he said. Nettie Pruitt runs a boarding house in town. Her husband died some years back. She's a friend. Dora was quiet for a moment. And the rest? Who did you mean by the rest when you listed the county road, the deputy, the reverend? He looked at her sideways. I didn't say the rest. You listed 4 things when I asked what to expect, she said. Early mornings, the deputy, the reverend, and the neighbor. You said them in an order. People say things in an order for a reason. He was quiet for a beat. You notice things, he said. I've had reasons to, she said. Not an accusation, not a confidence, just a fact, laid out simply the way she laid most things. He thought about the next thing to say, and then decided the next thing to say was nothing. She seemed to understand this and did not press. They put Pearl up for the night and went inside. It was on the 5th evening that she found the name. She had been reorganizing the kitchen shelf not because he asked, but because the system made no sense to her. And making sense of things was a way she managed her thinking, and in moving a tin of lamp oil she had disturbed a folded piece of paper that had been wedged between the shelf back and the wall. It fell to the counter. She picked it up, began to refold it without looking, and then looked. It was old. The paper was stiff and slightly yellow at the creases. At the top, in a formal printed hand, Duffland and Credit Company, Billings, Montana. Below that, dates and figures and signatures, most of which she did not examine. What she examined was the name at the top in heavier ink, the name of the party of the first part. Harlan Duff. She stood with the paper in her hands for 4 full seconds. Her face did not change. Her hands did not tremble. She refolded the paper, placed it back where it had been between the shelf and the wall at the same angle it had fallen from, moved the tin of lamp oil back into position, continued with the shelf. From the other room, Callum said, "There's coffee if you want it." "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level and warm and entirely usual. She placed the last tin and pressed her palms flat against the counter for just a moment, not resting, steadying. Then she went in for coffee. The days that followed had a surface of normalcy that both of them maintained with professionalism. Work in the morning, a meal at midday, separate afternoons that they accounted for to no one, evenings that had begun to develop their own small rhythms, her tea, his coffee, the lamp between them, conversation that moved in short, useful increments. He had begun without planning to tell her things about the land. Not about himself, about the land. Where the water table ran shallow and where it dropped. Which corners of the west pasture flooded in spring, and which drained. The name of the hawk that returned to the same cottonwood every evening at the same time, which he had observed for 5 years without knowing whether it was the same bird or a succession of birds all drawn to the same branch. She listened to these things the way she listened to everything attentively without performance. Sometimes she asked follow-up questions that indicated she had retained information from previous conversations, which was more than most people managed. One afternoon she said, "Who taught you to read land like that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Experience," he said. "What kind?" He looked out the window at the pasture. The hawk was on the cottonwood, which was on schedule. The kind that starts with paying attention for the wrong reasons, he said, and ends with paying attention because you don't know how to stop. She was quiet. Then, I understand that kind. He believed her. On a Tuesday, which was a deputy day, Callum came in from the south pasture in the late afternoon and found a wagon he didn't recognize, pulled off the road just past the cattle gate. Not stop parked. Parked differently from stopped. A man he didn't know sat in it doing nothing with particular conviction. Callum walked to the house at the same pace he'd been walking. He went inside, got his coffee, stood at the window. 20 minutes later, the wagon was still there. The man had not moved. Callum went back outside, crossed to the gate. The man looked at him with the blankness of someone performing indifference. "Help you," Callum said. "Resting the horse," the man said. The horse did not look tired. Callum held the man's eyes for 3 seconds. Then he walked back to the house. From the kitchen, where she was at the stove, Dora said, "Someone at the gate. Passing through," he said. He went to the back of the house, pulled a flat box from beneath his own bed. Not her room, his, and checked that it was where it was, which it was. Pushed it back. Came out to the kitchen. Poured a cup of coffee he didn't need. That evening at supper, he said, "If anyone asks, we were married in Billings at the county records office May of this year. Reverend Hollowell officiated." He said it the same way he said things about water tables, like practical information about terrain. She set her fork down, looked at him steadily. "Are we expecting someone to ask?" "It's possible," he said. "Should I know who?" He thought about this with what she had come to recognize as his particular form of deliberateness, not evasion, but genuine consideration of what it was and wasn't safe to say. "Not yet," he said. She picked up her fork. "All right," she said, and then, "But Callum." She waited until he looked at her. "When the answer changes, I'd like to be told." He met her eyes. Something passed between them that was not quite an agreement but was in the same family. "Fair," he said. 3 nights later, he woke at 2 in the morning to a sound that wasn't the house settling. He lay still and counted through the possibilities in the order they were likely wind animal. Something shifted by the cold. Then a 4th possibility that he had lived with long enough to recognize by feel. He got up, dressed in the dark, went to the kitchen where the window gave a view of the road. A rider, not moving, just sitting at the far edge of the darkness, too far to identify, too deliberate to be accidental. Callum stood at the window for a long time. He did not reach for the rifle. He just watched, which was its own kind of message in case the rider could see the lit window, and knew what stillness meant from the right kind of man. After 20 minutes, the rider turned and rode south without hurrying. The darkness closed behind him, the way water closes behind something dropped into it. Callum stayed at the window until he was certain the sound had fully gone. Then he stood there a little longer because certainty had never been a thing he trusted too quickly. The next morning, Nettie Pruitt came. She arrived in her own wagon just before 10, which was earlier than a social call and later than an emergency, which was its own kind of category. She was a broad woman in her 50s, practical-faced with the particular kind of composure that comes from having managed a boarding house for 20 years. She had seen enough versions of human difficulty that she had developed a consistent baseline around it. She and Callum spoke at the gate. Dora watched from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear what was said. She watched Callum's back the way it changed slightly over the course of the conversation. His shoulders did not drop or tighten. He did not move his hands. But something in the quality of his stillness shifted the way the light changes before a storm, when the sky is still technically clear. After 8 minutes, Nettie drove back toward town without coming in. Without looking toward the house, Callum came inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway. His face was arranged the way a face gets arranged when the person inside it is processing something that doesn't have a settled place to go yet. "Someone's looking for you," he said. She turned from the window, faced him fully. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you known?" "Since Philadelphia," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the hawk was on the cottonwood. The grass moved. Somewhere down the road, Nettie's wagon was raising a small line of dust that would hang in the air a few minutes and then be gone. "You should stay inside," he said. "From here on." She held his gaze with the same steadiness she'd held everything since that first afternoon on the platform. That particular patience of someone who has already rehearsed most of the bad versions of this and is waiting to see which one has arrived. "Callum," she said, "what are you afraid of?" He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "The same people you are." And she knew from the way he said it, not like a confession, not like a warning, but like something that had been true for longer than he'd wanted it to be, that whatever was coming, they were not standing on opposite sides of it. They were standing in the same field, in the same heat, looking in the same direction. That was either a comfort or a complication. She had learned by then that it was usually both. Deputy Ord Sykes arrived the next morning at 7:45, which was early enough to be intentional. He was a lean man in his mid-40s with a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent squint, and he rode with the particular uprightness of someone who had decided long ago that posture was authority. His badge caught the morning light twice on the way up the road. Once when he crested the low hill, once when he turned at the gate. Callum noticed both times. He was already outside when Sykes dismounted. "Callum," Sykes said with the familiarity of a man who has known you long enough to use your first name and not long enough to have earned it. "Ord," Callum said. Sykes tied his horse to the fence post with the slow deliberateness of a man performing relaxation. He looked at the house. "Heard you had company come in." "My wife," Callum said. "Came up from Philadelphia. We were married in May." Sykes nodded, looking at the house, not at Callum. "County office will want to see the paperwork eventually. County office can come by and I'll show it to them." Sykes smiled in the way that didn't mean anything. "Mind if I say hello?" "She's busy," Callum said. "A beat." Sykes looked at him now. The smile held its shape. "Just being neighborly, Callum." "You're being official," Callum said, "which is fine, but there's no cause here, and we both know it." Sykes held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the house one more time, the kind of look that was less about seeing and more about being seen looking. He untied his horse. "You take care now," he said. "We will," Callum said. He watched Sykes ride back down the road until the dust from the hooves had thinned to nothing. Then he stood there a little longer as he had stood at the window 3 nights before. The hawk was not on the cottonwood yet. The sky was clear and blank and enormous. He went inside. Dora was at the kitchen table. She had heard everything through the open window and had stayed where she was, which told him something about her judgment. She had a cup of tea in front of her that she wasn't drinking. "He knew who I was," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Callum said. "Before he came here." "Yes." She looked at the table. Something moved across her face, not fear, but something adjacent to it. The feeling a person has when a thing they knew was coming finally arrives, and the arrival is somehow still a surprise. "Emmett," she said quietly. And then nothing for a moment. And then, "I need to tell you about Emmett." She told it in the order it had happened, which was not the easiest order, but was the honest one. Emmett Cole had been a careful man. This was the first thing she said about him, and she said it with the particular precision of a woman who has chosen her words for someone who will understand what careful means in the context she's using it. Emmett had been careful. The way a man is careful when he knows the ground he's walking on has weak places. He tested every step, he mapped the soft spots, he knew exactly where the floor would hold and where it would give. He worked books for Duffland and Credit in Philadelphia, which was the Eastern office, the one that handled the correspondence and the paperwork and the accounts that didn't benefit from being in Montana where people could see them. Dora had not known this when she married him. She had known that he worked in finance for a land company and that he was quiet and dependable, and that he made her feel after Fletcher like perhaps the world was not entirely composed of bad luck and worse timing. She had met Fletcher first. She said this without much preamble, just laid it down like a stone she needed to set aside to get to the next thing. Fletcher Vane had been a delivery man in Philadelphia, 24 years old. Honest in the artless way of people who have never considered dishonesty as a real option. They married in 1923. She was 18. He was the kind of man who came home at the same time every evening and said what he meant, and laughed at things that were actually funny. She had loved him in the unguarded way of someone who had not yet learned that love required backup plans. In the spring of 1925, Fletcher made a delivery he didn't ask questions about. A crate sealed from a warehouse on the south side of the city to an address she had since memorized. 2 weeks later, a man she didn't know came to the door and told her Fletcher had been found in the river. Accident, the man said. Terrible thing. She had nodded and closed the door and then sat on the kitchen floor for 2 hours because the chairs had suddenly seemed like too much structure to impose on the kind of grief that had just arrived. The investigation lasted 4 days and concluded nothing. She told this part of the story in the same flat, direct tone she told everything. No pause for sympathy. No softening of the facts. Callum listened without moving his coffee in front of him, going cold. Then Emmett, she said. Emmett Cole, who worked for Duff, who had been kind, who had not known when he met her that she was the widow of a man who had crossed the same organization by accident. She had not known either, not then. She learned it in pieces over years, the way you learn most things that people would prefer you not learn through attention, through patience, through the small inconsistencies that stack up between what someone says and what the evidence around them suggests. By 1929, she had understood enough to understand that she was in a position she had arrived at from two different directions, neither of which she had chosen. And by then, Emmett had begun to understand it too. He had found irregularities, payments made to accounts that had no corresponding services, land acquired at prices that bore no relationship to value in years, when the previous owners had suffered particular reversals, droughts, deaths, debts that arrived at convenient moments. He had not been looking for these things. They had found him the way certain kinds of truth find people who are paying attention for entirely other reasons. He copied what he could. He told Dora to keep it if anything happened. He said this in October. In January, he fell from a horse he had ridden without difficulty for 3 years. She stopped here. Not for effect, she simply needed a moment to be past the telling of it before she continued. Callum said nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. The notebook has names, she said. Dates, specific transactions. It has the names of properties that were acquired after the owners defaulted on loans that had been called in early in violation of the original terms. It has the amounts paid. It has the witnesses to those transactions. She paused. Some of those witnesses are in this county. Callum looked at the table, at his coffee, at something past both of them. You came here because of the notebook, he said. I came here because it was the closest I could get, she said, without being the woman who was obviously coming. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The hawk had arrived on the cottonwood. He could see it through the window, settling its wings. Harlan Duff, he said. Yes, she said. He put both hands flat on the table. Dora. He said her name with a care that was also a kind of bracing the way you say a name when what follows will change something. I need to tell you something about myself. She looked at him. She had the quality in that moment of someone who already knows and is waiting to see whether the other person will say it. I worked for Harlan Duff, he said. From 1918 to 1924. I witnessed transactions. I delivered notices. I stood at doors while people were told things that ended their arrangements with their land. He looked at her steadily. Not as confession, he was past the performance of confession, but as fact. My name is in those books. Not as a victim. The silence that followed was not the easy silence they had built over the past week. It was a different kind. The silence that comes when two people are recalibrating what they know about a room they thought they understood. She did not look away. She did not speak immediately. She picked up her tea, which was long cold, and drank some of it. Did you know, she said finally, when you were doing it, did you know what it was? He considered this. I knew what the work was, he said. I told myself I didn't know what the work meant. That's a distinction I made up for my own convenience, and I knew it was made up. She set the cup down. And you stopped. I stopped, he said. Why then 1924? He looked at the window. Because I'd been stopping in my head for 2 years, he said. And eventually a man runs out of reasons to stay somewhere he's been trying to leave. She absorbed this. He could see her doing it, not the absorption of someone shocked, but of someone integrating new information into a framework that was already partially assembled. She was, he thought, one of the most composed people he had ever sat across a table from. And he had sat across tables from people in considerably more extreme circumstances. "The notebook has your name," she said. It was not an accusation. It was navigation. "I know," he said. "That complicates things." "Considerably," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't come here to use you," she said. "I know that too," he said. Another silence, shorter this time. "So," she said, "what do we do with all of this?" He went outside in the afternoon and did not come back until supper. She did not watch him go. She sat at the table after he left and opened the notebook. Not to review it, not to find anything new, just to sit with it. It was thin 40 or 50 pages of Emmett's careful handwriting, his figures precise and his margins clean. She had read it so many times that she could have reconstructed most of it from memory. She no longer needed to read it. She held it the way you hold something that connects you to a person you cannot reach. She thought about Fletcher, which she did not let herself do often, because it was not useful. She thought about the delivery he had made without question, the crate on the south side of Philadelphia, the 2 weeks that followed. She thought about whether there was a version of events in which she had understood things faster, or acted sooner, or made different choices, and arrived, as she always arrived, at the conclusion that there was not. The available information at any given moment had been insufficient. You worked with what you had. She thought about Callum. She had not expected him to say it. She had suspected it the folded paper, with Duff's name, the deputy's recognition, the careful inventory of threat he had run that first evening when he listed the county road and the neighbors. These were not the habits of someone with a clean history. They were the habits of someone who had learned to track what was coming from the direction of a specific kind of past. But she had not expected him to say it without being pressed. That was its own kind of information. She turned to a page near the back of the notebook. A transaction dated November 1922. The land involved was a homestead 40 miles east of Billings, transferred to Duff Land and Credit following a loan default. The witness signature at the bottom was not Emmett's. It was someone else's, a signature she had looked at many times without attaching a face to it. C. Reach. She looked at it for a while. Then she closed the notebook. Reverend Cass Hollowell arrived the following morning without warning, which was his custom, and which most people in the county had made their peace with over the years. He was 71 years old, and looked it, in the structural sense, the stoop, the deliberate movement, the face that had been organized by decades into something that communicated experience without communicating age. He drove a buggy that was as old as some of the sins he'd heard about, and he pulled up to the house and sat in it for a moment before climbing down, as if checking that the ground would receive him. Callum came out to meet him. Dora stood in the doorway. "Cass," Callum said, "I heard you got married," the Reverend said, not looking at Dora yet. "I also heard something else." "Come in," Callum said. Inside, Hollowell sat at the table with the deliberateness of a man who understood that sitting down meant something. He folded his hands. He looked at Dora with the assessment of someone who has spent 70 years looking at people in difficult moments and has developed reliable methods. "You were Emmett Cole's wife," he said. She said. He nodded. He had known it. He reached inside his coat and produced a paper folded into quarters and set it on the table. He did not slide it toward either of them. He placed it in the center equidistant, which was either theological or practical. That's a copy, he said. I made it in 1923. I've been holding it since. Callum unfolded it. Dora read it from where she sat. It was a record of land transfer dated February 1922. The property was a homestead belonging to a family named Breck. The loan had been called due in January, 3 weeks before the note's original maturity. The witnesses listed were 2 men, one of whom had moved away, the other of whom had not. Callum set the paper down without looking at Hollowell. "Why now?" he said. "Because the boy is back," Hollowell said. "Hale Breck. He's been working for Duff the past 2 years. He's in the county." He paused. "He knows your name, Callum. I don't know what he intends, but I thought you should know. He was here before you ran into him somewhere less predictable." The kitchen was quiet. "His mother," Dora said. "What happened to her?" Hollowell looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not grief exactly, but the residue of it. "She managed," he said. "The way people manage. She's in Miles City now. Her sister took them in." He looked at his folded hands. Hale was 9 when they lost the property. He remembers the winter. Callum stood. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room looking at the pasture, and whatever was happening inside him he kept there. Which Dora was beginning to understand was not concealment but architecture. He held things inside not to hide them, but because he had never built the outward infrastructure for them. There was no language, no gesture, no practiced expression. There was only the still back, the steady hands, the looking at something that wasn't there. "Thank you, Cass," he said. "I'm not here to help," Hollowell said, which was an odd thing to say. Then he added, "I'm here because I held this paper for 9 years, without doing anything about it, and I'd like not to hold it for 9 more." He stood. He took his hat from the table. "That's between me and my conscience. What you do with it is between you and yours." He nodded to Dora. He went out. They heard his buggy move back down the road. The sound thinned. The hawk was on the cottonwood. That night, Callum did not eat supper. He came in from outside at dark and went through the kitchen without stopping and into his room. And Dora heard him in there moving around in a contained way. Drawers opened and closed, something set on the floor. Something lifted and set down again. She ate alone and did not call to him, and did not go to the door. After an hour, the sound stopped. After another hour, she heard his door open, and then his footsteps in the kitchen, and then the back door going out. She went to the window. He crossed the yard in the dark and went into the barn where a lamp came on yellow and small through the slats. She sat with that for a while. Then she went to bed, but not to sleep, and lay in the dark of the back room with its gap under the door, and thought about a boy 9 years old, standing in a Montana winter watching 2 men sign a paper that ended the place where his life had been. One of those men was not in this story. The other was sleeping in a barn because he could not sleep in a house. She thought there are different ways to be implicated in something. There is the way of the man who designs it. There is the way of the man who carries it out. There is the way of the woman who marries into it without knowing, and the way of the woman who stays long enough to know and tells herself it isn't her business. She had been all of those things at different points. So in different proportions had Callum. So in a way that had cost him nothing and then cost him everything, had Emmett. This was not a story with clean hands anywhere in it. She slept eventually in the way of someone who has made a decision about something and can therefore stop turning it over. In the morning, she was at the stove when Callum came in from outside. He had the look of a man who had been awake before the light, which was different from a man who had not slept. There was a quality of having arrived at something rather than failed to find it. He sat down. She put coffee in front of him. He said, "There's a box under my bed." She turned, looked at him. "I've had it since 1924, he said. "When I left Duff, I took things I shouldn't have. Papers, records, copies of transactions I was part of." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I told myself it was for protection, that if he ever came after me, I'd have something." That was true. It was also not the whole truth. He looked at the coffee rather than at her. "I took them because I already knew somewhere. I didn't let myself look directly. That one day I was gonna need to put them somewhere they could be used. And I wasn't ready to be the person who used them yet." She turned fully from the stove. She looked at him for a long moment. He got up and went to his room. She heard the sound of the bed being moved slightly, and then the floor, a board loose, lifting. He came back to the kitchen carrying a flat wooden box, old, the lid fitted without a latch. He set it on the table and opened it. Papers. A stack of them organized in the meticulous way of someone who was not naturally meticulous, but had understood that precision would matter eventually. Dates and figures and property descriptions and signatures, the same handwriting that appeared on the back page of Emmett's notebook. She opened the notebook to that page, set it beside the box. They both looked at the two things on the table. Her records, his records. Emmett's careful copying and Callum's careful keeping, both of them done for reasons that were partly self-interested and partly something else. Something that didn't have a comfortable name but pointed in the same direction. She said, "There are pages missing from your records." He looked, went through them. His face changed not dramatically, just in the way of a man encountering a surprise he should have anticipated. "Someone got to them first," he said. "Someone inside," she said. He nodded slowly. "Which means someone knew this would matter eventually." He looked at the notebook. "Does yours cover it?" She found the relevant pages, laid them beside the gaps in his records. The correspondence was not perfect, but it was sufficient together. The two sets of documents told a story that neither told alone. She said, "We need someone who can put these in front of people who are required to look at them." "Helena," he said. "There's a lawyer there named Aldous Crane. He's old, and he's careful, and he has managed to operate independently of Duff for 30 years, which means either he's clever or he has something Duff wants protected, and either way he's useful. You know him." "I know of him," Callum said. "I was told to stay away from him once, which is recommendation enough. She looked at him. When were you told to stay away from him? 1921, he said, by someone who worked for Duff. She absorbed this. All right, she said. He closed the box. She closed the notebook. They sat across the table from each other with the two things between them, and neither spoke for a moment. And it was a different kind of silence from all the previous ones, not wary, not recalibrating. The silence of two people who have finished the inventory and know what they're working with. She said, "There's something I should tell you. I've been writing to a woman in Helena, a widow I met in Philadelphia whose husband also worked in the Eastern office. I wrote her when I arrived. I told her where I was." He looked at her steadily. "I was being careful," she said. "I didn't know what I was walking into. I wanted someone to know." "Is she trustworthy?" "She lost her husband the same way I lost Emmett," Dora said. "And she has been quiet about it for 2 years. That's a kind of trustworthy." He nodded, drank his coffee, set the cup down. "We go to Helena," he said. "Not tomorrow. We need to think about how to leave without it looking like leaving." She nodded. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he agreed. It was on the evening of the second day, the evening before they planned to go, that Hale Breck came to the property. Dora saw him first from the kitchen window. A young man 20 or so on a brown horse coming up the road at a walk. Not the careful walk of someone trying not to be noticed. The deliberate walk of someone who had decided not to hurry. She said, "Callum." He came to the window, looked. Something in his face went still in the particular way it went still when he was processing something that required him to be very controlled very quickly. He went outside. Dora stayed at the window. She watched. Hale Breck dismounted at the gate and tied his horse and walked up the path. And he was not what she had expected, which was a dangerous-looking man. He was lean and young and wore the careful blankness of someone who has spent time being angry and has recently moved beyond it to something quieter and colder. He stopped 10 feet from Callum. They stood there. She could not hear what was said. The window glass and the distance absorbed the words. But she watched the posture of both men. Neither advanced, neither retreated. Callum was still in the way. He was always still, not rigid, just positioned, his weight distributed like someone who has thought about where his feet are. Hale was still in the way of someone who had prepared something to say and was now measuring whether to say it. Then Hale spoke. One sentence. She saw it land on Callum the way certain things land, not like a blow, but like a sound that activates something already present. A resonance. Callum said nothing. He did not look down. He did not look away. He held the young man's gaze. Hale looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he turned and untied his horse and walked it back down the road at the same deliberate pace he had arrived. Callum stood where he was until Hale was gone. Then he stood there a little longer. When he came inside, Dora was standing in the kitchen doorway. She did not ask what was said. She had seen enough. "What did he want?" she said. "He wanted to know," Callum said, "if I remembered." She waited. "The winter of 1922, he said. "The Breck property." He stood in the kitchen in the evening light with the flat wooden box on the table between them. and whatever he was carrying inside his chest fully visible for the first time. Not because he had decided to show it, but because the situation had made concealment temporarily impossible. He wanted to know if I remembered. "Do you?" she said. "Every detail," he said. The lamp was between them on the table. Outside, the sky had gone amber and deep blue at the horizon. The kind of sky that precedes the dark with particular beauty, as if the day is making an argument for itself before it has to give up. The hawk was not on the cottonwood. It had gone to wherever hawks go when the light fails. She said, "Then you know what this is for." He looked at the box, at the notebook beside it. "I know what it's for," he said. He said it without emphasis or ceremony, just acknowledgement, the plain, full sound of a man who has finally said the true thing about a weight he has been carrying for long enough that he had almost forgotten it was a weight, and not just the way things felt. She nodded. The lamp burned between them, small and steady in the way of small, steady things that do not know. They're being noticed but hold the darkness back regardless. They left before sunrise, not in the manner of people fleeing, no urgency, no particular haste. Callum had thought about this and concluded that the most dangerous thing they could do was look like they were leaving in a way that warranted attention. So they left. The way a man and his wife might leave for a supply run to Helena wagon, loaded with practical things, horse-fed, and rested the lamp in the kitchen window, turned down, but not out. Dora had packed the notebook and the wooden box separately, each wrapped in cloth, each placed at the bottom of a different bag. Beneath ordinary items, flour, a change of clothes, a jar of preserves she'd made from the wild plums along the south fence. If anyone stopped them and looked, they would find the things people bring when they intend to return. The road north was empty in the early gray. The land on either side lay flat and still, the grass not yet moving in the morning air. Everything held in the particular suspension of the hour before full light, when the world has technically begun but hasn't committed to it yet. They rode without speaking for the first several miles. Then Dora said, "When we get to Crane, what do we tell him first?" "The documents," Callum said. "Not the story. People like Crane, careful people, people who have survived by knowing exactly what they're touching before they pick it up. They need the thing in front of them before they can decide whether to hear the rest." She considered this. "And if he says no?" "He won't say no," Callum said. "He'll say it's complicated and ask how much time we have and calculate the distance between what we have and what a court would require. But he won't say no." "How do you know?" He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved over a seam in the road, and the box in the back shifted slightly, and both of them registered the sound without comment. "Because Duff tried to have him disbarred in 1927, Callum said, "and a man who survives that doesn't forget what he survived it for." She looked at the road ahead. The sky was lightening in the east, a gradual brightening that turned the horizon from black to dark blue, to something that was almost gray. And the cottonwoods along the river caught the first available light in their upper branches and held it there, while everything below stayed dark. "He'll want to know about your name in the records," she said. "Yes." "What will you tell him?" "The truth." Callum said. That I was there. That I knew what I was doing well enough to do it, and told myself I didn't know well enough to stop it. That I left when I left. He paused. That I took the documents. That I kept them. That last part, she said. Why did you keep them? He looked at the road. I've thought about that a lot, he said. I told you the other morning I told myself it was protection. And that was true. But there's something underneath that. Something I didn't want to look at because looking at it meant admitting I'd been waiting for a reason to do the thing I should have done much sooner. He shifted the reins to one hand. I kept them because I knew one day they would matter to someone, and I couldn't throw away someone's one day. Dora was quiet for a long time after that. The light continued its slow work on the sky. A hawk, not the hawk from the cottonwood, a different one, crossed the road ahead of them at low altitude and climbed into the brightening air and was gone. Emmett kept the notebook for the same reason, she said finally. I know, Callum said. She looked at him. You couldn't have known him. No, he said, but I recognize the reason. Helena sat in a valley between low mountains that were green at the base and brown at the top, which in July gave them the appearance of things that had almost made it through something difficult and not quite finished. The city was larger than Billings enough. Traffic on the main roads, enough commerce, enough people moving in enough directions that two more people moving through it in a wagon did not constitute an event. Callum navigated by memory, which Dora had come to understand was the primary way he navigated most things. He did not consult anyone, did not study the street layouts, just moved through the city with the quiet assurance of someone who has learned a place well enough that it lives inside him rather than outside. Aldous Crane's office was on a side street off the commercial district. A narrow building pressed between a print shop and an accountant's office, with a painted sign above the door that was legible but not ambitious. The lettering said, A.E. Crane Attorney at Law, and nothing else, which was its own kind of statement about how Crane preferred to conduct his business. They tied the horse and went in. The office smelled like paper and pipe tobacco and the particular institutional quiet of a room where serious things get decided in low voices. A young man at a desk near the door looked up from a ledger. We'd like to see Mr. Crane, Callum said. It concerns a land matter. Several, in fact. He's with someone at the moment, the young man said. We'll wait, Dora said. They sat on a bench along the wall. The young man returned to his ledger. From behind the closed inner door came the low, indistinct murmur of a conversation that had been going on for some time. Dora sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the middle distance in the particular way of someone who has been waiting for a long time in a larger sense and finds the literal version of it relatively manageable. After 20 minutes, a man emerged from the inner office and left without making eye contact with anyone, which was a skill of its own. A moment later, the inner door opened again. Aldous Crane was older than Callum had expected. Late 70s, possibly 80, with the sparseness of the very old in his hair and face, but a quality of attention in his eyes that age had not touched. He wore a vest and no jacket, which gave him the look of someone who was always slightly in the middle of something. He looked at Callum. He looked at Dora. He looked at the bags they were carrying. Come in, he said, not as an invitation, as a conclusion he had already reached. They sat across from him at a desk that held in organized piles more paper than Dora had seen outside a library. Crane set his hands flat on the desk and looked at them with the steady patience of a man who has learned that people who come into his office with that particular quality of controlled urgency always get to the point if you let them sit with it for a moment. Callum set the wooden box on the desk. Dora set the notebook beside it. Crane looked at both for a moment. Then he opened the box. He went through it methodically, which was the only way he went through anything. He did not comment as he read. He did not change expression in any way that told them what he was finding, which was either professional discipline or the genuine effectlessness of someone who had seen enough. That this fell within a range he had already mapped. After 15 minutes, he set the last paper down and looked at the notebook. "May I?" Dora pushed it toward him. He read it in the same way, completely without commentary. When he finished, he set it precisely parallel to the papers from the box lining up their edges, and sat back in his chair. "These are serious documents," he said. "Yes," Callum said. "Some pages are missing from yours," Crane said, looking at the box. "I know. I noticed it recently. Someone inside had access to them before I took them." Crane looked at him with the steady, unreactive attention of a doctor listening to symptoms. "And you," he said, looking at Callum specifically. "Your name is in these records as a witness." "Yes." "To multiple transactions." "Yes." Crane was quiet for a moment. He looked at the papers. "Do you understand what that means for you in a proceeding?" "I understand what it means," Callum said. "My name doesn't go away. That's not what this is about." Crane looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at Dora. "And your connection?" "My second husband compiled the notebook," she said. "He died in January 1930. His death was recorded as accidental. And your first husband," she met his eyes. "Also accidental," she said. 1925. He made a delivery he didn't ask questions about." Crane looked at the desk. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, because Crane had evidently organized his capacity for surprise in a way that kept it from being visible, but something. An acknowledgement. "Harlan Duff has operated in this state for 30 years, Crane said. "He has survived 2 prior investigations, one of which—" He paused. The kind of pause a man takes when he is deciding how much of his own history to put on the table. "One of which I was involved in bringing, unsuccessfully." He looked at the documents again. "What you have here is more comprehensive than what I had then. Significantly." Another pause. "But comprehensive is not the same as sufficient." "We know," Dora said. "There are people in this county who lost land under the same mechanisms. We know of at least 7 families. They have their own records, their own recollections. They would testify." Crane looked at her. Something in his eyes shifted slightly, the adjustment of someone recalculating a situation. "You've spoken with them?" "Not yet," she said. "But I know where to find them." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents. He looked at the window where the Helena Street moved in its ordinary afternoon way, unremarkable and unhurried. "If I take this by—" He said, "I want you to understand something clearly. A county proceeding of this kind will not conclude in weeks. It may not conclude in months. Duff has resources, legal resources, political resources, and he will use all of them. What these documents can do is make the process public in a way that makes it harder for him to apply direct pressure to witnesses. He looked at Callum. That is not the same as protection. I know what protection looks like, Callum said. I'm not asking for it. Crane studied him for a moment with the look of someone who has heard that said before and is determining whether this time it means something. Then he looked at Dora. Your name will also be part of the record, he said. Both of your histories, the marriages, the deaths, all of it will be examined. I know, she said, and you're prepared for that. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Crane, I've been preparing for that since 1925. He sat with that for a moment. Then he closed the notebook carefully and placed both hands on it. I'll need 3 days to review these thoroughly, he said. I'll need you available for questions, and I'll need to know before the week is out whether those 7 families will stand. They'll stand, she said, with the certainty of someone who has not yet asked them but knows what the answer will be. They found a boarding house 2 streets over, respectable, anonymous, the kind of place that didn't ask about your business, because the people who ran it had learned that the answer was rarely as interesting as the asking. Callum paid for 2 days. They ate supper in the small dining room with 3 other guests who were absorbed in their own concerns and paid them no attention. Afterward, they sat in the narrow parlor off the lobby, which was empty. Dora had a cup of tea. Callum had nothing. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor in the particular way of a man who is not thinking about the floor. He'll do it, she said. Yes. You sound like that surprises you. Not surprises, he said. I prepared myself for resistance. When I don't need the preparation, I'm not sure where to put it. She looked at him. What did you think was going to happen when you imagined this? In 1924, when you took those papers and drove out to Billings and bought 40 acres and waited. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't imagine much past the taking, he said. I had the papers. That felt like enough for a while, like having a door handle without a door. She thought about this. And now there's a door, he said. He looked up. His face in the lamp of the small parlor had the quality it sometimes had in the kitchen. In the evenings, the face of someone who is not trying to look any particular way, which is rarer than it sounds and harder. Whether it opens is another matter, but it exists. She drank her tea. He said, you should know even if Crane does everything right, even if the county takes it up, even if it goes to a state level. Eventually, Duff's position won't collapse overnight. He has too much distributed. He'll lose pieces of it. The pieces that can be directly traced. But a man like that with 30 years of reach doesn't fall all at once. I know, she said. You came here for justice, he said. It was not quite a question, but had a question's shape. I came here to make it hard for him to keep doing it, she said. That's not the same thing, but it's what's available. She set down her cup. Fletcher deserved justice. Emmett deserved it. The Breck family deserved it. But what they deserved and what I can give them are different quantities, and I've been at peace with that long enough to be useful about it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the stillness, not the assessment, but something open in the way of a window that has been painted shut for a long time and has just been found to move. "You're the most practical person I've ever met," he said. "I mean that without reservation." She looked at him. Then she said, "What does that make you?" He thought about it. "A man who took 12 years to do what you managed in 6. She almost smiled. Almost, but not quite. Something in the almost was more honest than the full thing would have been. "Sleep," she said. "Tomorrow we find the families." The night before they went back to Billings, they stayed at a farmhouse outside of Helena that belonged to one of the families on the list. The Henders' husband and wife in their late 50s, with 2 grown children, and a stillness about them that told you they had been waiting for something without letting themselves say what. There were 7 families altogether. They had visited 5, with Dora going first each time because she had understood by the second visit that a woman arriving alone made a different first impression than a man arriving with a woman, and that the difference mattered in this particular kind of conversation. By the 4th family, she had the approach refined. She did not ask for anything immediately, she listened first. She told her own story before she asked for theirs, and she let the connection between what had happened to her and what had happened to them do the work that persuasion couldn't. All 5 said yes. The remaining 2, she was told, would also say yes. Callum had waited outside each time, which was its own kind of usefulness. He held the horse, he observed the roads, he noted which neighbors were within eyeline. When she came out, he read her face, and she read his, and they moved on. That evening in the Henders' kitchen with the husband and wife at the table, and Callum and Dora across from them, they talked for 2 hours about things that had not been talked about in years. The husband, his name was Roy, had a quality of controlled fury that he had clearly been managing for a long time, the kind of fury that had been civilized into something quieter and more durable. His wife, whose name was Cecile, was quieter still, with the efficiency of someone who has channeled grief into productivity and found that it actually works right up until the moment it doesn't. At the end of the evening, Roy Henders looked at Callum and said, "You worked for him." It was not an accusation. It was the kind of plain statement that carries its own weight and waits to see what gets added to it. "I did," Callum said. Roy looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he said, "I expect you know then how it was done." "I do," Callum said. "And I'll tell Crane everything I know, including my own part in it." Roy was quiet. Then he nodded. Not forgiveness, it was too early and the wrong shape for forgiveness, but acknowledgement. The same thing Hale Breck had come to the property to get and not received, and which Callum had understood he could not give. Yet not by words, not by explaining, only by showing up in the right room and saying the true thing. They slept that night in the Henders' spare room, which smelled of cedar and old wool. And outside the window, the Montana sky was clear and enormous and full of stars, in the extravagant way of skies far from cities. Dora lay awake for a while, not from anxiety, just from the particular wakefulness of a day that had been full. She thought about Emmett's handwriting, She thought about Fletcher's laugh, which she could still recall clearly enough, that recalling it felt less like memory and more like a sense the way you remember a smell more than a detail. She thought about the 7 families and the way some of them had cried and some of them had not, and how both of those things were the same thing in different containers. She thought, this is what it costs, not just the danger, not just the uncertainty. It costs the years. It costs the people you carry through the years. It costs the versions of yourself you left behind at different points along the way. But the cost existed whether you paid it forward or backward. Whether you did something or did nothing, the cost was already there. You were paying it regardless. The difference was what you got for it. She closed her eyes. The cedar smell held in the room. Outside, something moved through the grass, a night animal going about its business without interest in what people were arranging in the houses nearby. She let the sound of it carry her under and slept. Morning came gray and still at the Henders place, the kind of morning that arrives without announcement and asks nothing of you yet. Dora was up before Roy and Cecile, standing in their kitchen with a cup of water looking out at the yard, where the light was just beginning to separate the shapes of things from the dark around them. She did not make coffee. It was not her kitchen. She just stood there for a few minutes in the unclaimed quiet of early morning before the day had formed its demands and let herself be still. Callum came in from outside. He had been up earlier still, which did not surprise her. He moved through the kitchen with the consideration of a man. In someone else's house, took a cup from the shelf with care and stood beside her at the window. They did not speak. The yard clarified as the light strengthened. A rooster somewhere started in on its opinion. The ordinary world reassembling itself. Then they hitched the wagon and said their goodbyes and went. They were 2 miles outside of Billings on the return when Hale Breck appeared. He came from a side road at a walk. The brown horse relaxed his posture, the same deliberate calm as before. He pulled alongside the wagon on Callum's side and said nothing for a moment, just rode. Callum did not reach for anything. He looked at the road ahead. "I heard you were in Helena," Hale said. "News travels," Callum said. Hale looked at the wagon, at the bags in the back, at Dora briefly without hostility, then at the road again. "Duff knows you were there. He doesn't know why. He has ideas." "Let him have them," Callum said. Hale was quiet for a moment. "I'm not working for him anymore." Callum looked at him. "Since when?" "Since he had the Garfield family served with eviction papers on Tuesday," Hale said. "The daughter's the woman I intend to marry." He said it plainly, without self-consciousness, the way you say something you have already fully decided. "I handed my badge back yesterday morning. The wagon moved. The horses kept pace with each other without being directed to. On either side of the road, the yellow grass moved in the late afternoon wind. Dora said, 'Does Duff know you handed it back?' 'He knows,' Hale said. He wasn't surprised. I think he expected it eventually. He just didn't expect the timing." He looked at the road. "He's going to move quickly now. Whatever you're planning." "The county board meets in 10 days, Callum said. "Crane files before then." Hale absorbed this. "Will it hold?" "Long enough," Callum said. Another silence. The road bent slightly south, and the wagon followed it, and for a moment they were riding parallel with the sun, low behind them. The shadows of the horses stretched long across the yellow grass. Hale said, "I need to say something to you." He looked at Callum, not with the cold fury of the first visit that had been burned through or metabolized or set aside. What was left had a different quality, something between rawness and resolution. The face of someone who has arrived at the end of a long argument with himself. What happened in 1922? My mother, my family. He stopped, held it a moment. "I came to your property to see if you'd lie about it." "I know," Callum said. "You didn't." "No." Hale looked at the road again. "That's not the same as it being all right." "No," Callum said. "It's not." The silence after that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something that had been said correctly and didn't require more. After a moment, Callum said, "There will be room at the proceedings for another name, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Hale said, immediately without consideration, as if the decision had been made before the offer arrived. "I have my own records, 2 years of them." He paused. "He had me in a position where I knew things. I was useful for knowing things. That works in both directions." Callum looked at him for a moment. The young man had his mother's eyes. Probably he didn't know the mother, but he knew the shape of people who had absorbed hardship early and built themselves around it rather than against it. Hale Breck was not soft in any of the places that mattered. He was also not bitter in the ways that break things. He was something in between the particular steel of a man who has been angry for a long time and recently found a direction to point it. Dora said quietly to no one in particular, 3 sets of records." Hale looked at her. "Yours," she said. "His, Emmett's." She paused. "Whatever Crane has from 1927. She was quiet for a moment, her hands steady in her lap, the late afternoon light moving across her face. "That's enough." They arrived in Billings on a Thursday. The county board met on a Monday, and the days between had the quality of the period before weather, an unusual stillness, a particular density in the air that told you something was organizing itself in a direction you couldn't quite see yet. Callum did the ordinary things. He checked the fence along the west pasture that had shifted in their absence. He fed Pearl. He repaired the gap under the door of the back room, which he had been meaning to do for 7 years, and which he accomplished in 40 minutes with a strip of felt and 2 tacks in operation so simple that the 7-year delay was, he recognized, its own kind of information about the state he'd been in. Nettie Pruitt came on the Friday. She came to the house, which was different from the gate. She came to the door, and she knocked, and she waited, which was also different. When Dora opened the door, Nettie stood on the porch with her hands folded in front of her, and a look on her face that was something Dora recognized immediately, because she had worn that particular look herself at various points, the look of a person who has decided to say the true thing and is standing in the moment just before saying it, when it's still technically possible to not say it. "Come in," Dora said. Nettie sat at the kitchen table, which was the table at which most of the things in this house had been decided, and she told them about the note. Duff held the paper on the boarding house, she said. Had held it for 6 years. She had managed the payments, but when the note had been called early in the same mechanism, the records described the one that ran like a system, rather than a decision. She had been left with less than 2 months to cover 3 years remaining. The morning Dora's name had appeared in the passenger manifest at the billing station. Copied by someone in the telegraph office, passed along the chain that Duff maintained for exactly this kind of information. A man had come to the boarding house and told her what her options were. She had told them. She had told them who Dora was and where she was going. "I know what I did," Nettie said. Her voice was level but had a roughness underneath it. The sound of someone who has been sitting with something for long enough that it has pressed its shape into the interior of the chest. "I have thought about it every day." Dora looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Nettie, did they take the boarding house?" "Not yet," Nettie said. "He wanted information first. The house is the..." She paused. "The house is how he keeps me available." Dora said, "The boarding house will be in the proceeding, the note on it, the circumstances under which it was called. That's part of the pattern and it will be documented." She paused. "If you're willing to say so." Nettie looked at her, then at Callum, then back at her. "You do that," she said, not as doubt as genuine, undefended surprise. "It happened to you," Dora said simply. "It belongs in the record." Nettie sat with her hands flat on the table for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet around them. Then she said, "All right." Her voice had changed, not warmer exactly, but settled, like a room after the windows have been opened. "All right. Yes." The Monday meeting of the Yellowstone County Board of Commissioners was not an unusual event. It met regularly, it handled ordinary business, it was attended by farmers and merchants and creditors and local officials, and the occasional attorney appearing on behalf of a client. Crane had made the filing on Saturday. Callum had known he would not from Crane, who communicated only through his young associate, but from the specific absence of any disruption over the weekend, which told him that either Duff had not heard or Duff had heard and was calculating. Either way meant they had made it to Monday. They arrived early. The room was a large wood-paneled space on the second floor of the county building with windows on the south side that admitted the morning light in long, pale rectangles across the floor. Chairs were arranged in rows facing a raised table where the commissioners would sit. When Callum and Dora arrived, approximately half the chairs were occupied. The ordinary Monday attendance people with property disputes and zoning concerns and the routine machinery of civic life. Then the others began to arrive. Roy and Cecile Henders, two of the other families from Helena. Nettie, who sat 3 rows back and folded her hands and did not look at anyone in particular. Reverend Hollowell, who sat near the back with the posture of a man who has decided to witness something and intends to do so fully. Hale Breck, who came in last and took a seat on the far side of the room with a flat leather folio on his knees. Harlan Duff arrived at 5 minutes before 10. He was larger than Dora had expected, which was the first thing she noticed. He had the size of a man who had once been physically formidable and had transitioned over decades into a different kind of formidable, the kind that didn't require physical presence, because the physical presence had long since been replaced by the accumulated weight of what he owned and who he owned. He was 60 or so, well dressed in the way of men who understand that clothing is a form of argument, and he moved through the room with the particular ease of someone who has spent 30 years walking into rooms that arrange themselves around him. He saw Callum. He did not change expression. He took a seat on the right side of the room, 3 rows back, with Deputy Sykes beside him. He did not look at Dora. She found that more informative than if he had. Crane came in behind him. He moved to the front, set his case on the table reserved for presenting parties, and opened it with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has been in more of these rooms than he has fingers to count, and has long since stopped performing anything for anyone present. The commissioners filed in. 3 men of the age and type that held these positions in 1931 Montana, experienced, cautious, and possessed of the particular political awareness of people who have survived by understanding where power sat on any given morning. They arranged themselves at the raised table, and the chairman, a man named Forsyth, called the meeting to order. Crane stood. He presented the documents methodically in the order that built the clearest case, not chronologically, but structurally, so that each piece supported what came after it, rather than what had come before. He named the transactions. He named the properties. He named the mechanism by which loans had been called early in violation of original terms in years that had also seen particular hardships. For the affected parties, hardships that Crane paused to note had been neither predicted nor accidental, given what certain internal communications revealed about the timing. He named Harlan Duff. He named the company. He named the witnesses. When he came to Callum's name, he said it without particular emphasis, the same tone he used for everything else, which was the correct tone because the point was not to minimize it and not to dramatize it, but to place it accurately in the record in the position it actually occupied, which was neither minor nor central. Callum sat in the 3rd row. His hands were in his lap. His face was the face he wore when he was paying full attention to something while revealing nothing but Dora, who was beside him, could see the line of his jaw. She did not look at it long. Some things a person is owed the privacy of. Harlan Duff's attorney, a younger man who had come in late and now stood with his hands at his sides, objected 3 times. Each time Crane responded with a document. After the 3rd objection, the attorney sat down and did not stand again. Then Crane called the families. Roy Henders spoke first. He spoke in the flat, factual cadence of someone who has rehearsed not for persuasion, but for accuracy. He wanted to say it right, not to say it well. And the distinction was audible and credible. Cecile did not speak, but sat beside him in a way that constituted its own kind of testimony. 2 other family members spoke. Nettie Pruitt spoke briefly about the note and the call, and the options that had been presented to her, and she said it with a steadiness that cost her something, and that everyone in the room could see. Cost her something which was more persuasive than any smooth delivery would have been. Hale Breck stood and named his name and offered his records to the commission and said in the simplest possible terms that he had been employed by Duff Land and Credit for 2 years and had in that capacity personal knowledge of practices that extended the pattern Crane had documented into the present. He said this without looking at anyone in particular, and when he sat down he did not look at Callum either, and Callum did not look at him, and the space between those 2 not looks contained something that the room was not equipped to name, but that everyone in it could feel. Forsyth called a recess. During the recess, Duff spoke to his attorney in low, controlled tones near the window. Sykes stood slightly apart from both of them. Not with them, but near enough to have been with them all morning, and in the recess, he was clearly calculating something about that proximity and what it meant to continue it. He looked across the room once at no one in particular. Then he looked at the floor. Then he moved a half step to the left, which was also a half step away from where Duff was standing. It was a small movement. No one commented on it. But Callum, who noticed things, saw it. And Dora, who also noticed things, saw him see it. The recess ended. Forsyth spoke for 12 minutes. He did not use the word fraud. He used the words irregularities and pattern and warrant further examination, and referred for state-level review, which were the words available to a county commissioner who was being careful, and was also genuinely unsettled by what he had heard. He did not rule on anything. He could not rule this was not a trial, and Crane had known it was not a trial, and Dora had known it was not a trial. What it was the thing that made the next thing possible. When the meeting adjourned, Harlan Duff walked out of the room without looking at anyone. His attorney followed. Sykes followed after a pause. The families stayed. There was not afterward the kind of release that stories sometimes describe: no tears, no embraces, no sudden and complete exhaling of long-held breath. What happened was quieter than that. People who had been sitting with something very heavy for a very long time put it down. Not all at once, but in the way you put something heavy down. When your arms have been carrying it for so long that the act of releasing it is almost as effortful as the carrying your muscles don't know immediately what to do with the absence of the weight. Roy Henders shook Crane's hand. Crane accepted this without ceremony. Nettie, on her way out, paused beside Dora and said nothing. Just held her gaze for a moment, in the way of a woman conveying something that specific words would only reduce. Then she went out. Hollowell found Callum near the door. "Well," the old reverend said. "Well," Callum said. "It won't end here," Hollowell said. "You know that." "I know that," Callum said. Hollowell looked at him with the assessing, unsentimental kindness of a man who has been providing comfort for 50 years and has gotten efficient about it. "You did the right thing," he said. "Took you long enough." "Yes," Callum said. "That's not a criticism." "I know," Callum said. "It's still true." Hollowell nodded. He put on his hat. He went out into the Billings afternoon without additional comment, which was for Hollowell a form of approval. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon. The same road they had taken 2 weeks earlier. In the early dark. The same wagon, the same horse, the same sky pressing down on the land with its frank and enormous weight. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence was not the wary silence of the first drive, or the recalibrating silence of the kitchen after revelations. It was the silence of people who have been through something together and are still inside it, close enough to the edge that the distance back is visible. The ranch came into view. The barn that needed paint on the south side. The new fencing along the west pasture. The house, 2 rooms and a kitchen organized around the preferences of a single person for long enough that its single-personness was structural. Callum pulled up at the gate. He climbed down. She climbed down on the other side. He unhitched the horse. She carried the bags inside. By the time she had set them down and come back out, he had taken up the fence work on the east side, a post that had listed slightly in the dry summer ground, which he was reseating with the methodical attention of a man returning to ordinary things after extraordinary ones. She watched him for a moment. Then she went inside and put water on for coffee and came back out with a cup when it was ready and stood near the fence. He took the cup without stopping what he was doing. She stood in the late afternoon light, which was the particular golden light of late summer in Montana that made everything look like it had been there for a long time, and would be for a long time more. The grass moved. Pearl was in the paddock doing nothing with great patience. The hawk was on the cottonwood. "Duff won't fall quickly," Callum said. He was pressing the post down, testing its seat. "No," she said. "State review could take a year. Could take more. I know. And at the end of it..." He stopped, tested the post again. Satisfied, he straightened, looked at the fence line. "At the end of it, my name is still in the record. It doesn't come out." She looked at him. "I know that too." He turned, looked at her. The light was behind her, and he was looking into it slightly, which gave the moment the quality of something being looked at directly and clearly without shade. "You've known it the whole time," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "And you stayed." "I stayed," she said. It was not a declaration. It was a fact, said the way she said most facts plainly, without asking anything of the plain saying. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the fence line, and then at the pasture, and then at the cottonwood where the hawk sat, which had been sitting there every evening for 5 years, or possibly 5 different hawks, indistinguishable from one another, and which was there regardless. He turned back to the fence, picked up the mallet, set the next post with a single clean stroke that rang out across the pasture and faded into the open air. "I'm going to finish this fence before dark," he said. "All right," she said. She stayed where she was. She drank her coffee in the late afternoon light. He worked the fence beside her post by post, the sound of the mallet steady and rhythmic in the still air. They were on the same side of it. That was not everything, but it was the thing that made the rest possible, the long, slow, imperfect work of what came next. And it had not been given to them. They had built it in pieces in a kitchen with a lamp between them, over bad coffee and cold tea, and silence that had gone through enough iterations to arrive finally at the kind that held. The hawk shifted on its branch. The grass moved. The sun continued its slow work toward the horizon, taking its time as it always did, as everything out here always did, without hurry, without apology, indifferent to what men had done and concerned only with what the land required, which was in the end the most honest thing about it.